Welcome to Between the Lines, a monthly podcast that explores books for a better world, brought to you by the Institute of Development Studies. How lives and livelihoods change over time, and the forces behind those changes, is key to understanding development economics and addressing the issues of the Sustainable Development Goals. In this month's episode, we discuss the book How Lives Change, Palanpur, India and Development Economics, co-authored by Himanshu, Peter Lanjouw and Nicholas Stern. It draws on a 7-decade-long study of a single village and helps to illuminate the drivers of change and increase our understanding of why some people do better or worse than others. Interviewing Nicholas Stern and Himanshu is IDS Director Professor Melissa Leach.
Now, what this book does in brief is to provide a really unique in-depth look at the shifting lives and livelihoods of people in this one village, economy, society, institutions, drawing on a series of rounds of data collection using a really interesting mix of methods. And in doing so, it tracks and reveals some key themes, both in people's livelihoods, but also in what's going on in India, and indeed in theory and ideas in development studies and development economics. And it's this real interplay of villagers and theory that is really extraordinarily illuminating. And since reading it, I've been recommending this book to practically everyone I meet who wants to know about development. So you say this book's raising questions as much as providing answers, but yet on reading it, there are some very clear stories that do emerge about how lives and livelihoods are changing. And I wonder if you could tell us about some of those key dynamics that this latest study has picked up, because rural India has always been such a focus for thinking and research in development and development economics. And I think some of what you found actually challenges some of the dominant images about the relationship between the rural and the urban, the formal and the informal and so on, that have dominated a lot of work. So could you summarise maybe some of those key messages that have come from these really detailed rounds of survey work and the more ethnographic work you've done?
Let me try, and then I'm sure Himanshu will develop. The big questions are the questions of the title, How Lives Change. If development economics is about anything, and it is indeed about a lot, it's about that question, how lives change. How do people get better off? How do people get worse off? On what dimensions do they get better off or worse off? How is that shaped by the functionings of the economies and societies and the institutions and the politics of the communities in which they live? That, after all, is the big question that we've seen in economics if we go back 200 years or more to the classics of Smith, Ricardo and Marx. They were asking, how does the growth process work? And how does income distribution change with the forces and with the growth? And Marx was concerned with the division of surplus value between capital and labour and the very strong increasing returns notions. Ricardo was thinking about diminishing returns in land markets and, of course, then the distribution of income between the rentiers and the workers and the capitalists and so on. Those are the big questions, growth and distribution. And that's what we were after. I think we twist the tail of the profession just a little bit by saying, actually, maybe those questions haven't been at such centre stage or close enough to the centre stage in some of work over the last few decades. But they're absolutely centre stage for what we do. So one way of anchoring that in slightly more recent literature is, if you go back to Kuznets and Lewis and the way they were writing, soon after Second World War, they picked up those stories of Smith, Ricardo and Marx, but they gave it a story of both really, Lewis and Kuznets, stories of how people moved out of a backward, static, almost pathetic sector into a more dynamic, capitalist, profit-seeking sector, which was the modern economy. And that was their picture of how lives changed, how development occurred. And what we find is that some of those insights are interesting and helpful, but some pictures that it embodies are actually unhelpful.
So can you elaborate a little bit? I mean, commuting is a word that comes up a lot. So what's going on here?
In that Lewis story, people would leave one sector and go to another.
Yep.
Often you think of a physical transfer from a village to a town. Migration in that sense, internal migration. But we see much more people not doing either one job or another. They do many jobs. And the population density of the Indo-Gangetic Plain is such that you can get to a town. It includes Palanpur, of course, but it's absolutely not unique to Palanpur. You can get to a town in an hour or two. I mean, whatever it is, bike or bus or whatever it may be. And that's the way it's changed. And one way of expressing it is informal is normal. I mean, people go and find, and of course with mobile phones now, it's easier to find those kinds of jobs. So within a family, you would have 4 or 5 different sources of income without actual migration. And you see that process of change, and Himanshu will pick up on this, but you see that process of change has a profound effect on the income distribution. The old classical questions: how does the process of growth get driven, and how does the process of growth, together with the forces that drive it, determine distributions of income? If you look at the very early years of our studies, when the process of change was about intensification of agriculture, particularly after Zamindari abolition, investing in your own land, investing in investing in Persian wheels, then pumping sets and bore wells and so on. What you had is a process of mobility and entrepreneurship which led those people who had not yet built the irrigation facilities to catch up with those people who had. So that was a process of technological change, investment, innovation for them, of course, which led to catch up. But in the second part of the period, you have a process which leads to some people seeing those outside opportunities before others, and then it's a process where mobility takes you the other way as far as inequality is concerned. But perhaps, Himanshu, you'd want to develop that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, so just picking up on that, and frankly, there is not much of a distinction between the micro stories and the macro stories, or the structuralist the questions. The big questions are also the small questions, and the small questions are also the big questions. So there is no false. There is this kind of false binary that you either do this or. But what we have done, and I think what our disciplines have also recognized, not just our own discipline of economics, where we all 3 of us come from, but also other disciplines have recognized that things are far more complex than what we assume to be. And when he's talking about informal is normal, it's not just this versus that. It's something which is a gradation that we are trying to understand. It's a process that we are trying to understand. And that process has its own complications, not just rooted in the nature of production structure changing, but also how the society or the community itself is responding. And I think, look at economics, the economics itself. We are talking about behavioral economics, which draws on psychology and how people are interacting in different. Or, for example, institutional economics. Both of them have been recently been recognized by the Nobel Prizes. Or when somebody is talking about, say, for example, Elinor Ostrom is talking about the commons, for example. So we are talking about individuals who are embedded in the system and are responding in different ways to the changes which are coming from outside, but at the same time contributing to these changes in different ways. So when we say institutions are important, we are saying institutions are indigenous. They're not something which is there's a binary, two-way interaction between some of them. Caste, for example. Gender, again, something which we feel is something which is very, very important in understanding how things are evolving, not just in terms of economic outcomes. So what we have tried to do is not just to, and honestly, there are some answers that we think should be the answers. We are not saying that these are and there are people who can come up with different ways of expressing the same arguments and building on those ones. But we have tried to come to some kind of an explanation based on our own engagement with the village, which is fairly long. Nick has been there in the village for about 45 years and has been going to the village almost every year, except for some years, and we have all been. And that being there and trying to understand, talking to people, and that's why the qualitative information is also something that we've relied quite a lot on, how people themselves feel on those things. So we hope this will generate a debate We are not saying that, and there is learning is never a never-ending process. So I hope it does generate at least some kind of a debate, not just in the context, but also in terms of our disciplinary boundaries.
Maybe even some change in the profession.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that really interested me actually about the book is that you've taken this close focus methodology, including a lot of qualitative and interview type techniques and observation alongside the more classic quant survey work. And of course, these are methods that one doesn't necessarily associate with economics. I mean, I'm an anthropologist, and it's often been anthropologists or rural sociologists who have claimed this kind of close focus village work. And I actually wanted to ask you a little bit more about how you saw those disciplinary boundaries, because clearly this is a book that speaks to and challenges and takes us forward in theory and practice in economics, and particularly around questions about institutions and individuals or theorizing around inequality. But how do you feel it also interfaces with other disciplines? And did you understand this as a piece of interdisciplinary work, or is it actually a new way that economics should be doing its business?
No, we are not. I mean, I think economics has been interdisciplinary right from the beginning, whether you accept it or not. I mean, like it was. I mean, as long as we are part of the society, and when you're talking about, we are not talking about economy changing. We're talking about lives changing, and we're not talking about lives changing. Lives are governed by social institutions, political structures, and various different things. And nor is the fact that our own discipline is recognizing. I mean, in economics, for example, we are now talking about experimental economics, where people are doing laboratory experiments in terms of behavioral responses. And so we are, and I think the idea of using qualitative information is not something that we are the pioneers. It has been something that has been used in different ways by different people, I mean, including economists. Yeah. But I do feel that the questions are more important. Methodologies are built around that. Mm-hmm. And some questions require a different kind of an answer. And so there is no one way that you have to necessarily use qualitative for some things, quantitative may do better, a national representative survey may do better. And I think our own advice would be, or our own experience is that methods are obviously related to the questions. Yeah. And the kind of questions you're asking, you probably will be better off using all different forms of tools that are available to you, whether it comes from sociology, geography. I mean, we had lots of geographers in our team. Mm-hmm. And for example, the gender, for example, women survey that we had, which was led by Deepa Sinha, she, and we used multiple ways of it. Or for example, when you're looking at welfare rankings, inequalities, we used participatory rural appraisal, again, which is something which neither anthropologists in that sense have, or economics have used it, but practitioners have been using it in different ways. So we are using all sorts of things. And finally, the question is far more important and we don't see it as a boundary limiting us to the quest of knowledge on how lives are changing.
Yeah, perhaps an example will help. I mean, as Himanshu has described, we weren't worried about the boundaries. We were just trying to pursue an understanding of how lives change and how that society functions, particularly in shaping how lives change. So let give you one example. The Jattab group, which is they're the old chamars or leather workers, Dalits, the bottom of the pile, were in the early days just agricultural labourers within the village. Very little options and no land, or hardly any. So at the mercy of the village economy and the powerful within the village economy, and their income determined by large measure by the agricultural wage in that village. But then, of course, new options start to come, and some of them start to get jobs outside the village. Not very nice jobs, actually, brick kilns, which are pretty horrible, but at least they function through some of the slack periods in the agricultural season, and none of the people in the village could prevent them going and finding their jobs, and they did. It's entrepreneurship. It's spotting an opportunity and taking a risk. So they did. Not huge rewards, but at least it was an increase in income, and a more steady income. So they acquired the cash, which enabled them to be more credible as tenants for land inside the village, because nobody's going to lease land out to you, because it's still mostly, but not all, sharecropping, unless you've got the resources to cultivate. So started to get some resources to cultivate. But it needed more than that. It needed the tractor to replace the bullocks and the he-buffaloes. Mm-hmm. Because unless you've got the draft animals in the earlier part of the period, you couldn't be a credible cultivator and tenant. And no one who is higher than you will bring the draft animals to your plot of land, because they certainly wouldn't let you do it, because you might mistreat or overdo the draft animals. And they wouldn't do it because they won't want to be seen as labourers for you. But then the tractors come along, you see. And then what you can do, if you've got a bit of cash, is to pay the guy who's got the tractor to plough your land. There he is, sitting right up on the top of a high tractor. He's all right. He doesn't mind doing that. He's using his super capital equipment to make a bit of money off his farm. Yeah. So what you've got then is the outside labour market influencing the liquidity, which then makes them credible tenants, but not quite. It needed the technological change and the movement away from the draft animals. And all this is about processes of accumulation inside the village. It's about labour markets outside the village. And it's about the caste relationships which allow people to do certain things. And unless you put those together, you can't understand what happened.
Absolutely. No, that's a great story of the intertwining of the economic, the social, the technological. I mean, in many ways, one could title this book as a manifesto for development studies, not just for development economics, but that's another conversation. I wanted to ask you also about...
We're tweaking the tail of development economics just a little more than we tweak the tail of other things.
This is true. And you've got some great challenges to the narrower version of economic theory in there, which really make for excellent reading, and all students should look at it, I think.
But with a love and involvement for the subject of development economics.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But breadth and depth is crucial, yeah.
Totally. So what about new issues? I mean, there are probably many, but it struck me that one of the things you pick up on in this book, and actually say that this was not so relevant in the earlier studies, is the whole question of environmental change in the environmental and climate change context. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, well, why that's become important. I mean, obviously it's become important because of global environmental change, but how it's altered the dynamics in the village, or to what extent you've taken it on board as part of this study as different from others.
There are a number of dimensions, as always, in environment and climate. But let's start with the more environmental and go on to the climate. I mean, they're interwoven, and you shouldn't pull them apart. But there's been a lot. This is in the Gangetic Plain with very fertile soils, densely populated and very heavily cultivated. Nearly all grain crops and other vegetables and so on. Little bits of milk and pastoral, but mostly on the margins. And what's happened is there's been essentially, if you like, two sorts of mining going on. You've been mining the water because there's a water table underneath the Indo-Gangetic Plain. You've mined it in the sense that it's actually an exhaustible resource. And what you've done in what has happened in the Indo-Gangetic Plain is that water table's been driven down. Not just in India, but we're talking about, not just in that part of India, all over India and beyond, but we're talking about this particular area. Probably the water table's gone from maybe 15 feet to 45. I mean, it's gone up by a factor of at least 2, probably close to 3 as the level has gone down. And that means you spend more lifting. And in the early days of just a Persian wheel, where a child would drive some draft animals round and round the wheel and the chain of buckets, and you'd lift the water. But then, as it gets lower, you start to switch technologies, and of course as they become available, to 10 centimetre bores and diesel pumping sets on top. And then much more recently, because electricity hasn't been in the village very long, you've got some electric tube wells. But so the first thing is that water mining has increased the cost of agriculture. The second is that soil mining, I mean, if you just throw on nitrogenous fertilizers, of course you can see a result pretty quickly in drawing through the wheat or the rice or whatever it might be, but you start to run down the other features of the soil, and that certainly happened. if you're careless with the irrigation, you can wash the soil off, and if you're running an electric pumping set, it's very unreliable. You leave it on overnight, then it comes on overnight, but you're asleep, and then you don't look after the irrigation properly. So water table down, soil depleting, local pollution from factories of various kinds, including paper mill, and of course the cooking mostly dung and charcoal and coal within the hut. So in hut air pollution, serious issue. So those kinds of issues are there, but they're getting more intense. Climate change itself is building. The books seem to come out roughly 20 years apart, and each time we make predictions. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong, but we've tried to be transparent as to where we've got them right and where we've got them wrong. I think that when we write the next one 20 years from now, maybe it's even 10 years, but if we write the next book a decade or two from now, I think one of our predictions will be that the threats of climate change are getting very close. And if the ice and snow and glaciers on the Himalayas start to push back, of course they are being pushed back, if that accelerates, as it almost certainly will, then you will see water supplies becoming much, much less reliable. Torrents followed by drying up. And if the monsoon starts to fail, then you're in deep trouble, and it could fail very quickly. So I think that we haven't yet seen this happening very severely, but there's some straws in the wind. And my guess is that 20 years from now, if we look out, so that takes us, say, to 2040, and if we look out to the years 2040 to 2060, quite a short time in the history of work on Palanpur, you could get some very severe effects, and then it would be the whole of the Indo-Gangetic Plain.
That's a scary prospect. I think it's also, though, excellent that there might be another study. I was going to ask you, with 70 years going to become 80, 90 or even 100? But I think, in the light of thinking about the future, I wonder if you could just finish by telling me what you think some of the key messages might be for decision makers. We've talked a bit about the implications for researchers and students, that there are powerful messages here about broadening out development studies, about the value of this kind of close focus, problem-oriented, interdisciplinary methodology. But what does this say to policy? And in particular, aren't policymakers in the Indian context or more broadly going to be really challenged by dealing with the kinds of informality that you've picked up here? So what should they be doing?
Let me pick up a few of them. There are many there in the messages. First is that the economy is changing quite fast. And as Nick was mentioning about agriculture, the first wave of mechanization and irrigation did bring in more employment of labor. Like cropping intensity went from 1 to 2. Double. So that's why the more labor was required. Mechanization also meant that the land could be prepared very fast and harvesting could be done. And therefore more labor was required. But now we are in a phase where labor requirement in agriculture is going down drastically. It's happening all over the country as such. And labor is being released from agriculture, our population is growing. Where do you find employment for these people? Not just employment in terms of normal, the good quality, but even to basic diversification. That's a big challenge. Countries have faced this throughout centuries. Our centuries are full of, unfortunately, India is not like some other countries where you can have a forcibly population norms and therefore you restrict population growth, or you have a hook-counter system where you restrict mobility of people. You need to find ways where this new youth who are coming out of agriculture has to go and find productive jobs, a decent quality of jobs. That's a big challenge, and it's become a political issue. In India it's a big issue. The second question that I will find is we have to, and in this process, looking at this process, say for example, a lot of the way that we have looked at the informal sector, for example, is mostly as some kind of people who are not good. The kind of employment is not good, and they don't pay taxes. And so attempt has been to basically bring them in the financial net, bring them in the regulatory net, bring them into, and as seen as some kind of so in the whole discussion, we don't have the place for informal sector, but it is the sector which is actually the transition phase. I mean, it's something which absorbs the maximum amount of labor, this way or that way. And how do we treat with this informal sector? How do you make sure that your being part of the informal sector is not seen as a bad, but something as an essential transition process of it? And we need to have a better understanding of what informal sector means. It's not just the casual workers. It is also a large number of them self-employed, the petty producers. And those need to be provided some kind of a support. We don't have any credit policies working on those ones. We don't have any technology transfer policies working on them. We don't have any policies of government support for this informal sector. So that again is something which is a bigger challenge. But there are three more things that I would like to add to this. One is the way we are looking at institutions. I mean, institutions of governance are not just one part of the institutions that we're talking about. And we have reservation at the panchayati level, where now the head of the panchayat, the village council, is reserved for Dalit for one term, and then there's a women. They bring in different issues of governance at the local level. And there, how do you manage your concerns? And how do you manage this whole unity in the village or collective voice on certain issues? And that is where the fourth issue comes in. And point that we mentioned, that the village has seen progress. We are not saying the village is static. But the progress in terms of education, health, gender, and those kind of human development issues has been less than satisfactory. We would like it to be much faster, because those are essential for further growth in the economic sphere, but also in the social sphere. We would like more women to be part of the workforce. We would like more women to move out in the village. We would like more education to be provided. We would like children to be more healthy, more nutritious, no deaths in the maternal deaths. We would like all these things to happen. But that also requires a kind of an institutional arrangement, but also public policy engagement, where the society itself, collective responsibility. It can't be done only by the government. The government has to find some way of dealing with that. And we're finding those things which are being incorporated in there. And the last point that I think where I will say, and this is, I'm not saying that there are lots of challenges which are there. And the last challenge is actually the issue, which is how do we look at the whole issue of villages and rural India? The point that we make here is that rural India is not we can't look at rural India and urban India as silos. There is a continuum. When does the rural end with the urban? We can't say that these are urban, these are rural. So there is a gradation which is there. And as the world is getting more connected through communication, mobiles, through wireless, and through also for some forms of information flows, and the kind of anthropologists will also appreciate the kind of information flow that is happening, but also economically. When he says that there is within half an hour you can reach urban areas, and there are different ways of it. Now that obviously is changing the relationship between rural and urban. The notion of rural or the villages as a closed community or entity is no longer true. Villages are as much part of it, and they're not only part of the neighboring urban. They are connected to Delhi, they are connected to Hyderabad, they are connected to Mumbai, and they are also connected to London and New York. And I'm saying that is something which is, again, we have to understand, and policy has to realize that how is this transition happening? That transition will happen. How do you manage it? And governments will have to be creative in managing this transition rather than using the standard methods that are available.
That's a really important set of messages. So, look, as a final question, we talk about books for a better world. This is a book that can contribute to a better world. Could each of you, just in a final few seconds, give me your key headline? If this is going to contribute to a better world, who needs to read it and why?
I think those who are working to try to accelerate growth and poverty reduction, those who are working to make something of the Sustainable Development Goals agreed in 2015, could benefit in thinking through the kind of policies that Himanshu has just described. Yeah. If you think of Sustainable Development Goals, we talk about employment, poverty, hunger, inequality, pollution, gender relations. I've gone through probably 8 or 9 of the SDGs, but of which there's 17. But if you want to understand how you can make a difference, you have to understand how lives change. You have to understand how people find ways out of poverty, how their willingness to take risks and their ability to spot opportunities is there, but they can be greatly enhanced if they get support through the health and the education and the credit markets and the backup employment schemes and so on. So I think those are interested in growth and poverty reduction, and the SDGs, which I hope is a very large slice of the social science profession and indeed of the policy makers. I hope they could get some benefit.
Yeah. Himanshu, who should read this and why?
I mean, if you ask me, everybody should.
Everybody. Okay.
I mean, that's, I think,
Yeah.
I mean, it's something which will interest not just social sciences, somebody who is a journalist, somebody who is a student of art, somebody who is, as long as we are talking about people in a system and in a society, and sciences, people who are in sciences would be, the kind of scientific challenges and scientific innovations that are required to deal with the magnitude of problems that we are talking about. It is not just a problem of social sciences and people who are in the policies. It has to be everybody. And that's, I would say that it will interest somebody who is not a specialist also.
Yeah, what Himanshu says prompted me to, because it's very important what he just said. We don't have the elegance of Dickens and Balzac. None of us would pretend to that. But we are concerned with what they were concerned with, which is the human condition, how it changes, what people can do to change their lives. So in that sense, I thought Himanshu put it very well. I would underscore the everybody.
Yeah. One village with very important lessons for all humanity. Thank you so much, Himanshu and Nick, and everybody do read this book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you like this, then please subscribe and share. Between the Lines is a monthly podcast published the first Wednesday of every month. It's brought to you by the Institute of Development Studies. Follow us on Twitter at IDS_UK or visit ids.ac.uk.